Naples, 1981. Behind the bars of a prison cell sat a man in a flawless suit, a notebook of poetry on his desk. To the world, he was Raffaele Cutolo, the poet king. From his cell, he commanded thousands, ignited a Mafia war that killed hundreds, and even touched the hands of politicians. How could one man be both poet and killer, philosopher and warlord? This is the story of the Mafia boss who ruled Italy without ever leaving prison. Ottaviano, a small town in the shadow of Mount Vesuvius, did not look like the birthplace of a king. Its streets were narrow, twisting ribbons of cobblestone that clung to the mountainside. In the late 1940s, children played barefoot in the dust, their laughter mixing with the cries of market sellers and the tolling bells of the church. Housewives leaned from their balconies, hanging out sheets that were more patchwork than cloth, while men lingered in doorways with cigarettes, talking about politics they didn't believe in and debts they could never repay. It was a place marked by hunger. Post-war Italy was broken, and the South carried the heaviest scars. Families lived in single rooms, rats scuttled in alleys, and the black market thrived more than the honest trade. In Ottaviano, to survive was to improvise, to outsmart, to outfight. And it was in this soil of poverty and pride that Raffaele Cutolo was born, in 1941. The boy with two faces. From the start, people noticed something unusual about him. Raffaele was not the strongest child, nor the loudest. He had dark eyes that seemed to look past people rather than at them, as if studying something beyond the horizon. Teachers said he had a sharp mind, but he rarely stayed long enough in class to prove it. He would disappear into the streets, into the taverns where men fought with words first and knives later. Yet at night, when the town quieted, Raffaele could be found scratching words onto scraps of paper. Poetry. Verses about God, about love, about the dignity of men who had nothing. His mother kept these pages hidden, proud of his sensitivity, worried about his temper, because there was a second side to the boy. He was quick to anger, quicker to draw a blade. The streets were his true classroom, and there, respect came only through fear. By his teenage years, he was already known in Ottaviano, not as a scholar, but as a fighter. The lesson of the knife. In southern Italy, the knife was more than a weapon. It was a symbol, a tool for settling insults, for carving out one's name in a place where the state's authority barely reached. Raffaele carried his first blade at 15. By 16, he had already spilled blood. Not murder, not yet, but enough to earn a reputation. He learned early that violence was currency, and like all young men who rise in such worlds, he discovered that the more reckless he was, the more others whispered his name. But he was not reckless for the sake of chaos. No, there was something calculated about the way he carried himself. Even in the smoke-filled taverns, even in the brawls, he had a strange calmness, a way of speaking softly before striking hard. One older man in town would later say, "Cutolo had the eyes of a poet and the heart of a wolf." That was the danger. Ottaviano's mirror. To understand Cutolo is to understand Ottaviano itself. The town was caught between tradition and desperation. On Sundays, families filled the church, crossing themselves beneath the painted saints. On weekdays, those same men dealt in contraband cigarettes, stolen goods, and favors owed. The Camorra, the Neapolitan Mafia, was not an outside force here. It was woven into the fabric of daily life. Children grew up hearing that the law was something written in Rome, but the real power lay closer, in the man who could protect you or destroy you with a single command. For young Raffaele, this was not corruption. It was simply truth. First blood, first destiny. In 1963, the truth arrived with a knife's edge. Raffaele was 21. A tavern, a drunken fight, an insult traded too far. His blade found a man's chest, and the man did not rise again. Murder! The arrest came quickly, but even then, Cutolo did not look like a broken young man. Witnesses said he walked into custody with a strange dignity, almost as if he knew this was not an end, but a beginning. Because in Naples, prison was not always punishment. For the right kind of man, prison was opportunity, a throne behind walls. And as the gates of Poggio Real prison closed behind him, Raffaele Cutolo stepped onto the stage of his true life. Foreshadow of a king. Inside, he would find men hungry for leadership, men who saw in him not just another hot-headed boy, but someone with vision. He would write verses that inspired loyalty, and give speeches that sounded like prophecy. He would dress not as a criminal, but as a professor, a statesman, a king in waiting. But all of that comes later. For now, in Ottaviano, people whispered about the boy who had killed and gone to prison with the air of a prince. Some pitied him, others feared him, and some, though they didn't know why, began to believe they had seen the birth of something larger than a man, something like destiny. From the narrow streets of Ottaviano to the blood-stained floor of a tavern, Raffaele Cutolo's path was set. He was no longer just a boy with verses in his pocket. He was a murderer, and prison, the place meant to break him, was about to make him king. Naples, 1963. The city was a cauldron of noise and desperation, its streets heavy with cigarette smoke and the scent of frying oil. Bars spilled light onto the cobblestones. Voices clashed, laughter, curses, arguments, all weaving into the restless music of a city that never truly slept. Inside one such tavern, a young man named Raffaele Cutolo sat at a corner table. He was 21, tall and lean, with slicked-back hair and the quiet arrogance of someone who already believed he was destined for more than Ottaviano's narrow alleys. He wasn't there to start trouble. Not exactly. But trouble has a way of finding young men who carry knives and reputations. The spark. It began with an insult. It always did. A man, older, drunk, with a heavy swagger of someone who had spent his life in these smoky rooms, mocked Raffaele. Some say it was about a woman. Others claim it was about money owed. The truth has been lost in the haze of time. What is certain is this: the words struck like flint against steel. Cutolo stood, his voice quiet, measured. He gave the man a chance to step back. Witnesses later said that was what made him different. He did not rush, did not shout. He warned. But the man laughed, and the laughter sealed his fate. The knife flashed once. The room gasped, and in the space of a heartbeat, a life drained onto the tavern floor. The arrest. The carabinieri came quickly, boots pounding against the cobblestones outside. Cutolo did not run. He did not weep. He simply placed the knife on the table and waited. When they marched him through the streets of Ottaviano in handcuffs, neighbors leaned from windows to watch. Some crossed themselves. Others whispered. He was only 21, but already people sensed something unusual. There was no shame in his walk, no fear, only a strange calmness, as if the act had been part of a larger story, and he was merely turning the next page. The trial. The courtroom smelled of sweat and ink. Wooden benches creaked beneath the weight of families, journalists, and curious neighbors. The prosecutor painted him as a cold-blooded killer, a thug who had no place among decent men. But Cutolo, when allowed to speak, shocked them all. He spoke clearly, without hesitation. He admitted the fight, admitted the stabbing, but framed it as honor, an old word heavy in southern Italy. To dishonor a man, he said, was to kill him slowly. He had only hastened what had already been done. Some jurors shifted uncomfortably. His words were not those of an uneducated street punk. They carried rhythm, almost like verses, like poetry. The verdict, guilty. The sentence, life in prison. And yet, as the gavel fell, a whisper passed through the court. This was not the end of Raffaele Cutolo. It was the beginning. The gates of Poggio Real prison, Naples, a fortress of stone and iron, built to crush men into silence. Cells cramped, air heavy with sweat and rot, guards indifferent to suffering. Most who entered left broken. But not Cutolo. From the first day, he carried himself not as a prisoner, but as a ruler in exile. He wore his clothes neatly pressed, his shoes polished. He greeted guards with courtesy, but without deference. Among inmates, he spoke softly, asking questions, listening. And slowly, the other prisoners began to gather around him. The professor emerges. They called him Il Professor. The professor. He quoted Dante. He spoke of loyalty, of destiny, of building something greater than petty theft and random violence. In a place where men had lost hope, he gave them a vision, a new Camorra, disciplined and united. Not just a gang, but an organization. It was here, behind bars, that the seed of the Nuova Camorra Organizzata, NCO, was planted. The paradox. And yet, even in these early days, the contradiction was clear. In the mornings, Cutolo could be seen scribbling verses about love and faith, lines filled with tenderness and longing. In the afternoons, he would settle disputes between prisoners with the precision of a general, sometimes with words, sometimes with blood. Poet, killer, philosopher, gangster. The lines blurred until they no longer existed. The whisper in Naples. Outside the walls, Naples changed. New bosses rose, old families fought, and the Camorra's grip on the city tightened. But already, whispers spread that something unusual was happening inside Poggio Real. A young man, barely more than a boy, was gathering followers. His words were like sermons. His vision was like prophecy. And though he was locked away, the streets of Naples seemed to hum with his name. Raffaele Cutolo, the boy who had killed in a tavern fight. The man who would soon sit on a prison throne. The cell was small, but Raffaele Cutolo carried himself as if it were a chamber in a palace. Where others slouched in despair, he straightened his shoulders, smoothing the wrinkles from his jacket. He insisted on dressing with care, shirts pressed, shoes polished, hair combed neatly back. In a world where men were stripped of dignity, he created his own throne from discipline. By the mid-1970s, Poggio Real prison had become his domain, not by brute force alone, but by something far more powerful, vision. The prison kingdom. Poggio Real was a city within stone walls. Thousands of men, many condemned to decades, formed a society with its own laws, markets, and hierarchies. Cigarettes were currency, bread was bargaining power, and alliances were survival. Into this chaos stepped Cutolo, a man who spoke not of petty theft or drunken brawls, but of destiny. He called the Camorra not a gang but a tradition, something ancient and honorable that could be renewed, strengthened, reborn. And so, in whispered meetings beneath flickering bulbs, Cutolo planted the seed of his empire, the Nuova Camorra Organizzata. The vision. What made him different was not just his ruthlessness, it was his sense of theatre. He required rituals. New recruits swore oaths over blood, invoking saints and shadows alike. He spoke to them not as criminals, but as soldiers in a holy war against disrespect and disorder. The old Camorra is weak, he told them. It fights for scraps. But we will be an army. We will restore honor to Naples. And we will do it with loyalty, with discipline, with belief. Belief. That was the word he repeated again and again. For men who had been forgotten by society, belief was intoxicating. The professor's sermons. Each evening, Cutolo would gather his followers in the yard. He read aloud from Dante and Petrarch, weaving poetry into lessons on survival. "See," he said, holding a worn copy of the Divine Comedy, "even Dante walked through hell to find paradise. And so must we." To the guards, it looked harmless, even cultured, a young man with a book, reciting verses. But to the prisoners, his words carried the weight of prophecy. Soon, he was not just a leader. He was a figure of faith. Power beyond the walls. The brilliance of Cutolo's system was that it did not stop at the prison gates. He used lawyers, wives, girlfriends, anyone who visited, to carry his words outside. Orders were smuggled in letters, coded in poetry, whispered in visiting rooms. On the streets of Naples, shops began paying tribute to the NCO. Young men carried out robberies, extortions, and drug deals in Cutolo's name. Rival clans who refused found themselves hunted, their bodies left in alleys as warnings. From a cell barely large enough to stretch his legs, Cutolo commanded hundreds. Soon, it would be thousands. The first trials of power. Every king faces challenges. Cutolo's came in the form of the old Camorra bosses, men who had ruled Naples long before him, men who saw this professor as an upstart. They underestimated him. When one clan leader mocked Cutolo, dismissing him as a child in a suit, his lieutenants found their car riddled with bullets the next morning. Another rival who refused to bend was discovered in the countryside, bound and executed, the letters NCO carved into the dirt beside him. It was brutal theatre, and it worked. Fear spread faster than bullets. The mask of the poet. What baffled observers was how a man so violent could appear so refined. Journalists who attended his court hearings described a polite, soft-spoken man who quoted literature and bowed respectfully to judges. Yet behind that mask, he signed death sentences with the calmness of a teacher grading papers. The contradiction only deepened his legend. A king without a crown. By the end of the 1970s, the Nuova Camorra Organizzata was no longer just an idea. It was a reality. Thousands swore loyalty. Businesses paid tribute. Politicians whispered his name. And all of it flowed back to a single cell in Poggio Real. Cutolo had transformed from a murderer in a tavern fight into something else entirely. A monarch in the shadows. But kings cannot exist without wars. And the streets of Naples were about to run red. The gates of Poggio Real clanged shut each night with the finality of a coffin lid. For most men, it was the sound of hope dying, the reminder that freedom lay somewhere beyond those walls, untouchable. But for Raffaele Cutolo, that sound was the tolling of a bell announcing his reign. Inside those walls, he was not a prisoner. He was a sovereign, a city of stone and iron. Poggio Real was no ordinary prison. Built to hold thousands, it was a sprawling fortress of cell blocks, courtyards, and corridors that stank of sweat, damp stone, and despair. It was a city in miniature, with its own economy, its own alliances, its own unwritten laws. Here, men gambled away their meals. They smuggled contraband cigarettes, shared stories, traded favors, and fought for scraps of dignity. Guards were little more than referees, occasionally brutal, often corrupt. Into this world stepped Cutolo, not as a victim of the system, but as a man determined to master it. The throne is claimed. He began quietly. A loaf of bread shared here, a cigarette offered there, a word of kindness to a broken man who had no one left outside. He listened. He remembered names, families, debts. Soon, prisoners realized that if they came to Cutolo with a problem, it was solved. If they needed protection, he provided it. If they owed money, he mediated fairly. What began as respect soon became dependence. And dependence, in a prison, is power. By the early 1970s, Cutolo's cell was no longer just a room with a bed and bars. It was a court. Men waited in line outside, hoping for an audience with IL Professor. Guards looked the other way. Some even escorted visitors, recognizing his influence kept the blocks quieter than their batons ever could. Ritual and order. Cutolo's genius was in transforming chaos into ritual. He required every member of his new brotherhood to swear an oath. The ceremony was solemn. Hands cut, blood mingled with ink, words recited that invoked both saints and the honor of men long dead. The Nuova Camorra Organizzata is not just crime, he told them. It is destiny. It is order. It is our salvation from the rot of the old ways. Those who took the oath became soldiers. Those who refused became targets. Soon, Poggio Real echoed with whispers of loyalty to the NCO. Life in the kingdom. Every day followed a rhythm. In the mornings, Cutolo read from his books, sometimes scripture, sometimes poetry. Prisoners would gather, listening as if attending Mass. He spoke of Dante's journey through hell, of Petrarch's longing, of saints who had suffered. His voice was calm, measured, hypnotic. By afternoon, disputes were brought before him. A debt over a card game. An insult exchanged in the yard. A fight over bread. Cutolo listened, judged, and ruled. Sometimes his decisions ended with a handshake. Sometimes they ended with blood on the stones. And in the evenings, after the clang of the gates, he would sit in his cell, writing verses. Lines about love, about the dignity of man, about the strange fate of souls trapped in cages. To the guards, he was a model inmate. To his followers, he was a prophet. Power beyond walls. What shocked Italy most was not Cutolo's command inside Poggio Real. It was his reach outside it. Through wives, girlfriends, lawyers, even bribed guards, his words travelled. A folded note slipped into a loaf of bread. A poem with hidden codes sent to a friend. A whispered order in the visiting room. On the streets of Naples, entire neighborhoods began to bend to his will. Shops paid tribute. Young men pledged allegiance. Rival clans found themselves ambushed by NCO soldiers acting under orders that had originated from a man locked behind iron gates. From his prison throne, Cutolo ruled like no gangster before him. The mask of civility. When brought to court for hearings, journalists were stunned. Here was the so-called Mafia boss, dressed in immaculate suits, polite to judges, articulate in speech. He quoted Latin phrases, cited philosophers, and addressed the press with calm dignity. To some, he looked like a reformer, a man misunderstood by the system. To others, he was a dangerous wolf cloaked in silk. One journalist wrote, "He does not shout, he does not threaten. He smiles, he recites poetry. And yet, behind those words lies the authority to kill with a nod. Enemies in the shadows. No throne exists without rivals." The older Camorra bosses despised him. They called him an upstart, a dreamer who wrapped violence in poetry. But their contempt did not protect them. From Poggio Real, Cutolo's hand reached into their businesses, their streets, their homes. Some were forced to bend the knee. Others were eliminated. Each funeral in Naples whispered his power louder than any speech. The state takes notice. By the late 1970s, the Italian government could no longer ignore him. Reports circulated in Rome. A prisoner was running a Mafia army from his cell. Politicians demanded action. Yet action came slowly. For in the shadows, some suspected that even men in government found his influence useful. And so, year after year, Cutolo sat in Poggio Real, a king without a crown, building his empire stone by stone, verse by verse. Foreshadow of war. But the Camorra was not united. His rise created fractures. Alliances formed against him. The streets outside began to simmer, ready to boil over into open conflict. And as Naples braced for war, one thing became clear. Raffaele Cutolo, the poet king, would not step aside. By the late 1970s, Naples was no longer simply a city. It was a battlefield waiting to ignite. The cobblestone alleys of Quartieri Spagnoli, the crowded markets of Forcella, the crumbling apartments of Scampia, all whispered the same rumor: the professor's army is growing. The Nuova Camorra Organizzata had become a force too large to ignore, and with its rise came inevitable resistance. The spark of conflict. The old Camorra families, the Giuliano clan, the Alfieri, the Bardolino, and others, watched with fury as their territories slipped away. 4 generations, these families had ruled Naples like feudal lords. Their power was rooted in bloodlines, traditions, and ancient codes whispered from father to son. And then came Raffaele Cutolo, a man without pedigree, a convict who dared to style himself a king. He dressed in suits, recited poetry, demanded loyalty not by birthright but by sheer force of will. To the old guard, it was an insult. To Cutolo's followers, it was liberation. The clash was inevitable. The NCO expands. From Poggio Real, Cutolo directed the expansion of the NCO like a general conducting a campaign. Every district of Naples was mapped, divided, claimed. Local bosses were summoned to pledge allegiance. Some swore loyalty eagerly, seduced by the vision of discipline and order. Others refused, clinging to their independence. For the latter, punishment was swift. A bakery burned to the ground in broad daylight. A shopkeeper who resisted payments was found beaten and tied to a lamppost. Rival soldiers disappeared, their bodies discovered days later in the outskirts, throats cut. Each act carried a signature, ruthless efficiency paired with theatrical symbolism. It was not enough to kill. The killing had to speak. Blood in the streets. By 1980, Naples was drowning in violence. Gunshots cracked in alleys at night. Families barricaded their doors. Mothers whispered prayers as their sons left home, unsure if they would return. The newspapers called it the Camorra War. But to those who lived it, it was not war in the conventional sense. It was a slow bleed, a city consuming itself, one corpse at a time. The NCO soldiers, many barely out of their teens, wore leather jackets and carried pistols tucked in their belts. They swaggered through the streets, confident, invincible in the shadow of their leader. They called him, "Oh, Professor," the Professor, and when they killed, they did it with the certainty that his words sanctified their bullets. Cutolo's calm. Inside Poggio Real, Cutolo remained unshaken. While the city burned, he read poetry, attended mass, and held court in his cell. Visitors brought him updates: who had fallen, who had betrayed, which shops had paid tribute, which territories had been taken. He listened, nodded, gave quiet instructions. To onlookers, it was as if the violence outside was a chessboard, and Cutolo was simply moving pieces. "War is not chaos," he once told a follower. "It is order. It is the only way to cleanse rot from a system. And when the war is done, there will be peace, but it will be our peace." The old guard strikes back. The rival clans did not remain passive. They formed coalitions, pooling resources, striking at NCO strongholds. Markets once loyal to Cutolo suddenly declared allegiance to his enemies. Informants within Poggio Real whispered that the old bosses were bribing guards to restrict his communications. The result was escalation. Drive-by shootings became daily. Explosions rattled apartment blocks. In one notorious incident, an NCO lieutenant was gunned down outside a church, his blood staining the steps where children had just received communion. Naples, once chaotic but survivable, now lived under the constant shadow of death. The public reacts. Ordinary people felt trapped between monsters. The old clans demanded tribute. The NCO demanded loyalty. Refusal meant ruin. Compliance meant complicity. Every shopkeeper, every taxi driver, every dock worker had to choose a side. And yet, disturbingly, many admired Cutolo. He spoke of honor, of protecting the poor, of building a Camorra that punished corruption and rewarded loyalty. To some, he seemed less a criminal and more a dark savior, a man who had given order where the state had only offered neglect. But the corpses piling up told another story. The year 1980. The war reached its peak in 1980. Estimates vary, but some say more than 500 people were killed in the conflict. Whole neighborhoods became battlegrounds. Police forces, overwhelmed and undermanned, struggled to contain the violence. Yet through it all, Cutolo's power only grew. The bloodshed seemed to prove his inevitability. Each rival who fell was another stone laid in the foundation of his empire. The poet amidst the war. And still, in his cell, he wrote verses about love, about death, about the destiny of souls. Guards sometimes found scraps of paper in his handwriting, lines that read like prayers, others like threats wrapped in metaphor. "The rose grows among thorns," one line read, "and the thorn cannot cut the hand of the gardener who planted it." To his followers, these words were scripture. To his enemies, they were omens, foreshadow of politics. But as bodies filled the morgues, another, stranger rumor began to spread. Politicians in Rome, faced with crises of their own, were said to be whispering Cutolo's name. Some claimed they would soon need him, not to destroy, but to negotiate. The idea was unthinkable. A Mafia boss, already ruling a war-torn city from prison, being courted by the state itself? And yet, in Italy, stranger bargains had been struck. The year was 1981. Naples lived in terror, and yet in fascination. Newspapers filled their front pages with the same paradoxical figure, Raffaele Cutolo, a man described in one breath as a cold-blooded killer, and in the next as a philosopher-poet. How could both be true? How could one man carry the voice of a prophet and the hand of an executioner? The contradiction was the very essence of his legend. The mask of the poet. Inside Poggio Real, Cutolo crafted an image carefully. He walked the corridors not like a criminal, but like a teacher. Prisoners called him Il Professor, the professor, not only because of his intelligence, but because of the way he carried himself. He spent hours reading by the dim light of his cell. Dante, Petrarch, the Bible. He quoted passages to his followers, using them as lessons. His handwriting was neat, his speech articulate, his gestures calm. Visitors left with the impression that they had spoken to a man of culture, even refinement. Some journalists even described him as a man born for philosophy, but trapped in crime. And yet, outside those walls, his soldiers spilled blood daily. The orders of death. Cutolo rarely raised his voice. He rarely gave long explanations. When a rival needed to be eliminated, He would pause in conversation, glance at a lieutenant, and nod. Nothing more. That nod could mean the death of a shopkeeper who refused tribute, the silencing of a rival lieutenant, the erasure of a family that had dared to resist. His followers described these moments with awe. He spoke gently, almost kindly, but when he gave the order, it was like a priest giving absolution. Final, without doubt. And so, death walked hand in hand with poetry. The prison sermons. Each week, Cutolo gathered his closest men in the yard. He recited poetry, sometimes his own, sometimes borrowed, lines about the suffering of the poor, the dignity of men forgotten by society, the inevitability of destiny. The words were not merely art. They were ideology. They gave shape to violence, justifying it as part of a grander order. One prisoner recalled, "When he spoke, you believed killing was not murder. It was justice. He made you believe you were part of something bigger, holy even." In this way, Cutolo transformed killers into believers. The contradiction. It was this contradiction that obsessed Italy. Judges who saw him in court were baffled. How could the same man who quoted Petrarch with elegance be responsible for hundreds of deaths? Guards whispered about the scraps of poetry found in his cell, verses that spoke of love and longing, as if written by a man imprisoned unjustly. And yet they also carried letters in which he ordered executions with surgical precision. Even his enemies admitted the paradox. One rival Camorrista, before being gunned down, said of Cutolo, "He kills with one hand and blesses with the other." The image in the media. Television cameras captured him arriving at hearings in crisp suits, polished shoes, hair combed like a politician. He smiled politely at journalists, answered questions in full sentences, sprinkled with references to history and faith. For ordinary Italians watching the evening news, the effect was chilling. This was not the image of a wild gangster, nor a brutish thug. This was something stranger, a man who seemed half intellectual, half executioner. And the media, fascinated, gave him a stage. Each headline, each photograph, made the legend of the poet king grow. The inner circle. Those closest to him saw both sides most clearly. In the evenings, he would invite his lieutenants into his cell. He offered them espresso brewed on a smuggled burner, sometimes a glass of contraband wine. They talked about poetry, about faith, about their mothers. Cutolo asked about their families, remembered their children's names. Then, in the same breath, he would discuss which rival needed to disappear. He would weigh the death of a man as calmly as he weighed the rhyme of a verse. "Every life is a poem," he once said. "Some are finished too soon. Some are finished by me." The room would fall silent, his men nodding. None dared to question him. Why they followed. The paradox was not a weakness. It was the source of his power. Men followed Cutolo because he made them believe. He gave dignity to their suffering. He told them they were not mere criminals, but soldiers in a grand design, and in return they obeyed without hesitation, even when obedience meant blood on their hands. He was, at once, their priest and their executioner, their poet and their general, a growing shadow. Outside, the violence only worsened. The Camorra War claimed hundreds of lives. Streets ran red. Families were torn apart. Naples became a city of funerals. But in the minds of many, the man at the center of it was not merely a gangster. He was a riddle, a symbol, the poet, the killer, the king in the shadows, a whisper of politics. And as the bodies piled high, whispers spread that the state itself was beginning to take notice, not simply as an enemy, but perhaps as a tool. Because in Italy, politics and crime had always danced together. And soon, Cutolo's paradox would lead him not only into the headlines of newspapers, but into the secret halls of power. Naples, 1981. The city was still scarred from the Camorra War. Blood stained its alleys, funerals clogged its churches, and mothers wept over sons who would never return. Yet, in that same year, a new storm gathered, one not born of clan rivalry, but of politics. It began not in Naples, but in the turbulent heart of Italy itself. The Red Brigades. The Brigate Ross, the Red Brigades, were Italy's most feared left-wing terrorist group. Born from the student protests of the late 1960s, they had evolved into a shadow army. Kidnappings, assassinations, and bombings were their language. In 1978, they shocked the world by kidnapping and murdering former Prime Minister Aldo Moro after 55 days in captivity. That act had already scarred Italy's soul. By 1981, their name still evoked terror. And then, in the spring of that year, they struck again. The kidnapping of Ciro Cirillo. Ciro Cirillo, a Christian Democrat politician, was taken hostage in Naples. The Red Brigades stormed his home, killing his bodyguards and abducting him in front of his family. The motive? To demand concessions from the government. For most Italians, the scene felt like a nightmare replayed. Once again, the Red Brigades held a man of the state's power in their hands. Once again, the government seemed paralyzed. But this time, the story would twist in ways no one could have predicted. The whispered solution. Unlike Aldo Moro, Cirillo did not die in captivity. After 89 days, he was released. Why? The official version was vague. Negotiations, political maneuvering, perhaps ransom. But the unofficial whispers told a darker tale. Those whispers said that Raffaele Cutolo, sitting in his prison cell in Poggio Reale, played a role. The poet king as mediator. According to rumors, the Christian Democrats turned to the one man who held influence where they did not, Cutolo. The logic was brutal but simple. The Red Brigades were ruthless, but they operated on Neapolitan soil. And in Naples, nothing moved without Cutolo's knowledge. From his prison throne, Cutolo controlled not only soldiers but networks of loyalty that stretched deep into the city. If anyone could negotiate or pressure for Cirillo's release, it was him. The whispers claimed emissaries were sent, that meetings took place in the shadows, that promises were exchanged, money, leniency, favors. And then, as if by miracle, Cirillo was freed. The nation reacts. The idea was explosive. Had the Italian state, humiliated by the Moro affair, quietly bargained with a Mafia boss to save one of its own? Journalists latched onto the theory. Politicians denied it furiously. But in Naples, the people believed. They said, only Cutolo could have done it. Only the poet king had that kind of reach. The paradox grew sharper. Here was a man condemned as a killer, yet whispered about as a savior. A gangster, yet also a mediator. A prisoner, yet with influence greater than ministers. Cutolo's silence. When asked, Cutolo gave his signature half-smile. He neither confirmed nor denied. Instead, he leaned back, folded his hands, and said softly, "There are times when even the state must ask the professor for lessons." The ambiguity was deliberate. For him, myth was as powerful as fact. Whether or not he truly freed Cirillo mattered less than the belief that he had. The power of perception. For the NCO, the rumors were worth more than gold. Cutolo's soldiers strutted through Naples with newfound pride. "Our boss," they said, "does not just rule the streets. He rules the politicians. It was propaganda of the highest order, and it terrified his enemies. If the state itself would bend to Cutolo, what hope did rival clans have? The shadow bargain. Historians still debate the truth. Some insist the government secretly funneled millions through intermediaries, with the NCO ensuring Cirillo's release. Others argue Cutolo exaggerated his role, inflating his legend. But in Mafia history, truth is often less important than perception. And the perception was clear. Cutolo had crossed a line no Camorra boss had crossed before. He had blurred the boundary between the underworld and the state itself. The poet king's empire. From his cell, Cutolo savoured the rumours. He continued to write poetry, verses about destiny and power, while simultaneously directing his lieutenants to expand territory. Extortion rackets thrived, heroin markets flourished, and his word remained law. To the public, he was now more than a gangster. He was a shadow statesman. The legacy of the affair. The Cirillo affair cemented Cutolo's myth. He was no longer just a king of the prison. He was a man who could make the state kneel, who could rescue politicians when the republic itself was powerless. But such power comes at a cost. The old clans seethed with rage. The state, humiliated, would not forgive. And beneath the grandeur of his myth, cracks in his empire were already beginning to form. The war was not over. It was only escalating. By 1980, Naples was a city under siege, not by foreign armies, nor by invading powers, but by its own blood. The Camorra had always thrived in shadows, smuggling, extortion, favors traded like currency. But now, with the rise of Raffaele Cutolo's Nuova Camorra Organizzata, NCO, the shadows erupted into fire. What followed was not a feud. It was a war. The lines are drawn. The NCO, disciplined and loyal to the professor, stood against an alliance of old families. Giuliano, Alfieri, Bardolino, Nuvoletta. These clans, though rivals themselves, understood one truth. They had to unite or be devoured by Cutolo's army. Naples became a chessboard. Every district, Forcella, Secondigliano, Scampia, San Giovanni, was contested ground. Shops, markets, ports, and drug routes were no longer mere businesses. They were battlefields. And every soldier on both sides carried the knowledge that betrayal meant death. The streets run red. Gunfire became as common as church bells. Motorbikes roared through alleys, 2 men riding, one to steer, one to shoot. Bodies fell in marketplaces, bullets tearing through fruit stalls and butcher shops. Children learned to dive at the sound of engines. Mothers buried sons week after week, their wails echoing through courtyards. Funeral processions clogged the streets so often that Naples seemed a city permanently dressed in black. The newspapers tried to count the dead, but the numbers blurred. Some say more than 500 people were killed in just a few years. Others claim the toll was even higher. It was not war in the conventional sense. There were no front lines, no ceasefires. Only 1,000 little assassinations, each one feeding the cycle of vengeance. Cutolo's invisible hand. And yet, the architect of it all sat in a prison cell. From Poggio Real, Cutolo directed his army with calm precision. Orders travelled through lawyers, wives, coded letters, even smuggled cassette tapes. A verse of poetry could conceal a command to kill. Witnesses described him in those years as serene, almost detached. While others screamed for vengeance, he spoke softly, as if narrating inevitabilities rather than giving orders. To his followers, this calmness was divine. To his enemies, it was terrifying. The cult of loyalty. The NCO was not just a gang. It was a movement. Young men from the poorest districts joined eagerly, drawn by the promise of belonging. Cutolo gave them rituals, oaths, songs of brotherhood. They were not merely criminals. They were soldiers of destiny. They called themselves Cutoliani, proud to serve under the professor's banner. Even as bullets flew, their loyalty rarely wavered. For them, dying for Cutolo was not failure. It was honor. The counterattack. But the old clans were not so easily destroyed. They had their own soldiers, their own money, their own networks stretching into politics and the international drug trade. And they had something the NCO lacked: experience in surviving decades of blood feuds. They struck back mercilessly. Entire NCO crews were wiped out in ambushes. Families loyal to Cutolo were terrorized, their shops burned, their homes bombed. The war became a cycle of massacre and revenge, and the streets of Naples became a graveyard, the public lives in fear. Ordinary Neapolitans were caught in the crossfire. Every knock at the door after midnight felt like death. Every walk to the market carried the risk of crossfire. Shops closed early, shutters pulled tight before sundown. And yet, disturbingly, many still admired Cutolo. They whispered that he was fighting not just for himself, but for the poor, against the corruption of the old clans. Myth wrapped itself around violence, turning a gangster into a legend. The state watches. In Rome, politicians could no longer pretend this was ordinary crime. The violence was too visible, too destabilizing. Reports landed on desks. Cutolo's NCO was not only killing rivals, it was threatening to reshape the entire balance of power in southern Italy. And yet, action came slowly. For some suspected that the state itself had benefited from his reach, especially during the Cirillo affair. The result was paralysis. And in that paralysis, the war raged on. The turning tide. By the mid-1980s, however, the tide began to shift. The coalition of old clans grew stronger, coordinated by figures like Carmine Alfieri and Antonio Bardolino. They targeted Cutolo's lieutenants relentlessly, dismantling the NCO's external structure piece by piece. Without the same deep-rooted networks, the NCO began to falter. And though Cutolo still commanded loyalty from his cell, isolation measures tightened. His communications were monitored, his influence slowly squeezed. The professor's empire, built on words and blood, began to crack. The legacy of the war. By the time the dust settled, Naples was changed forever. Entire neighborhoods were scarred, families destroyed. The Camorra itself had evolved, less a collection of small clans, more a modern, ruthless machine shaped by the crucible of war. And at the center of it all was one man, the poet king, who had written verses by candlelight while commanding a slaughter that claimed hundreds. The Camorra Wars made Cutolo immortal in the mythology of Naples. But they also set in motion his downfall, because no king can rule forever, and every throne eventually rots beneath the weight of its own blood. Every empire looks eternal when it rises, but history whispers the same truth again and again: nothing lasts. Not crowns, not dynasties, not even kingdoms built on fear. For Raffaele Cutolo, the cracks began quietly, and then, like all fractures, they spread until the whole throne collapsed beneath him. The war's toll. By 1984, Naples was exhausted. The Camorra Wars had painted the streets red. Thousands of families were shattered. Businesses bled money. The morgues overflowed. Even hardened killers began to wonder, what was it all for? The coalition of rival clans, Alfieri, Bardolino, Nuvoletta, had survived. More than that, they had adapted. They pooled their resources, coordinated their attacks, and cut deep into NCO territory. Slowly, painfully, the professor's once mighty army began to shrink. The isolation of the king. The Italian state, humiliated by years of violence and whispers of collusion, finally struck back with force. Cutolo was moved from Poggio Reale to high-security prisons, isolated from his men. Guards intercepted his letters, visits were curtailed, lawyers monitored. The channels of communication that had once carried his voice to the streets were now severed. For a man whose power was built on words, silence was the deadliest prison. The weight of betrayal. But it was not only the state that turned against him. His own lieutenants, once sworn to loyalty with blood oaths, began to defect. Some joined the rival clans. Others sought deals with prosecutors, trading testimony for reduced sentences. The professor, who had once inspired absolute devotion, now watched as men he had raised like sons betrayed him. Each defection was another crack in the throne. One defector, when asked why he abandoned Cutolo, answered simply, "A king who cannot protect his soldiers is no king at all." The enemies grow stronger. Meanwhile, his rivals flourished. Carmine Alfieri built alliances that stretched beyond Naples, weaving webs of influence in Rome. Antonio Bardolino expanded into the international cocaine trade, tying the Camorra to Colombian cartels and amassing wealth beyond anything the NCO had imagined. While Cutolo wrote verses in his cell, his enemies built empires in the open air. The myth collapses. For years, Cutolo had thrived on myth, the idea that he was untouchable, omnipotent, a king whose reach extended even into politics. But myths are fragile. When NCO soldiers began to die in droves, when extortion money dried up, when allies disappeared, the illusion cracked. Ordinary Neapolitans, who had once whispered of the professor with awe, began to shake their heads. Perhaps he was not destiny incarnate. Perhaps he was only a man, and men can be defeated. Inside the cell. In those years, Cutolo grew more withdrawn. He still dressed immaculately, still carried himself with dignity, but there was a heaviness in his eyes. He continued to write poetry, filling notebooks with verses about betrayal, fate, and the loneliness of power. Some lines were bitter. I gave them order, and they gave me treachery. Others sounded like resignation. A king without a crown is only a prisoner with memories. The trials. The Italian courts delivered blow after blow. Witnesses testified, confessions poured in, sentences stacked. Each trial was another nail hammered into the coffin of his empire. The once proud professor stood in the dock, still articulate, still calm, but diminished. Journalists noted the change. His words were polished, but they no longer carried the weight of inevitability. The fall of the NCO. By the late 1980s, the NCO was no more. The organization that had once commanded thousands had splintered. Some remnants were absorbed into rival clans. Others simply vanished, their leaders dead or imprisoned. The dream of a new Camorra, disciplined and united under one man, was over, and Cutolo, its architect, was left alone, a king in silence. Cutolo remained behind bars, locked away in high-security isolation. No more court audiences filled with followers. No more coded letters passed like scripture. No more whispers of a poet-king ruling Naples from his cell. Only silence, and the slow, inevitable passage of time. The lesson of the cracks. The cracks in his throne revealed a truth older than any poem. Power built on blood cannot endure. For a season, it terrifies. For a moment, it seems eternal. But eventually, every crown rusts. And so, the poet-king became the forgotten king, alive, but already half a ghost. The 1990s arrived, but for Raffaele Cutolo, time no longer meant progress. It meant repetition. The same grey walls, the same clanging gates, the same narrow strip of sky above the prison yard. Once he had ruled Naples from behind bars. Once his word had carried armies into battle. But now his empire was gone. He remained alive. But he was no longer remembered as a king, only as a prisoner. The long silence. In high-security isolation, the days blurred. Guards rotated, indifferent. Cells were checked, meals delivered, lights turned on and off. Nothing changed. For a man who had thrived on influence, on the electricity of whispered loyalty, silence was the harshest punishment. Letters no longer came with coded pledges of devotion. Visitors dwindled. The corridors echoed not with respect, but with absence. Cutolo kept his dignity. He rose each morning, dressed carefully, smoothed his hair. But the performance was no longer for followers. It was for himself, a stubborn ritual of resistance against the decay of time. The poet remains. What remained was the pen. In notebooks smuggled by sympathetic hands or purchased through prison channels, Cutolo poured out words, poems of loss, of betrayal, of God's silence, lines that ached with longing. I once commanded a city. Now I command only memory. Some verses carried bitterness. They worshipped me when I fed them power, but abandoned me when hunger came. Others were almost tender, recalling childhood in Ottaviano, the scent of bread in alleys, the laughter of his mother. For the world outside, he was a forgotten gangster. For himself, he remained a poet. The world moves on. Outside his walls, Naples transformed. New bosses rose, men like Carmine Alfieri, Antonio Bardolino, and later, the Casalisi clan. They built fortunes not only on extortion but on cocaine shipments and international trade. The Camorra of the 1990s was no longer Cutolo's dream of unity and discipline. It was fragmented, ruthless, global. The professor's vision had crumbled. Young men no longer whispered his name with reverence. They joined new clans, swearing loyalty to leaders they could touch, not a ghost in a cell. Occasional headlines. Every few years, his name flickered back into the newspapers. A new trial. An old sentence confirmed. A rare photograph of him escorted by guards, hair greyer, shoulders still straight. Journalists described him as a relic, a symbol of another era. Once he had terrified a city. Now he was a man the world barely remembered. And yet, even those brief appearances reignited fascination. Italians could not fully forget the paradox. The poet-king who once ruled from a cell. Family and faith. Cutolo found fragments of solace in family. His sister, Rosetta, remained fiercely loyal, managing what little remnants of his affairs lingered. She was called the godmother by the press, though her influence was never equal to his. He also turned increasingly to faith. In some verses he wrote of God's judgment, of sin, of the hope for redemption. Whether this was true repentance or merely another mask, none could say. But even priests who visited him admitted, when he speaks, you feel both sorrow and pride. He still believes he was chosen for something larger than life. The body weakens. Time, however, spares no king. Cutolo aged in captivity. His once commanding presence diminished. His health faltered, illnesses untreated, the toll of decades behind bars. Photographs from the 2000s showed a gaunt man, his eyes sunken but still sharp, still burning with the remnants of pride. Yet beneath the pride was resignation. The throne was gone. The followers were gone. Only the shell of the poet-king remained, forgotten, but not erased. In Naples, the younger generation barely spoke his name. To them, he was history, a figure from their father's time. But among the old, stories lingered. They remembered the fear, the violence, the strange sermons in prison yards. They remembered how a single man had once made the state tremble. Legends, after all, never die completely. The final years. By the 2010s, Cutolo was an old man, his body failing, his mind still scribbling poems no one read. He had spent more than half a century behind bars. He had outlived rivals, wars, and empires. But in the end, his world was reduced to four walls and fading memory. In 2021, he died in prison. No crown, no throne, no army, only silence. The forgotten king. And yet, forgotten does not mean erased. Because when Italians speak of the Camorra, his name still surfaces, not as the richest, nor the most ruthless, but as the strangest. The poet-king, a man who ruled a city from a cell, who wrapped murder in verse, who blurred the line between literature and blood. For some, he was a monster. For others, a myth. For history, he remains a contradiction, an emperor of shadows who ended as a prisoner of time. When Raffaele Cutolo drew his last breath in 2021, the walls of the prison did not tremble. There were no parades, no mourners filling the streets, no sons pledging vengeance at his grave. His passing was quiet, almost invisible, and yet his shadow still lingered, because the legacy of the poet-king was not measured in gold or empires. It was carved in two elements more enduring than flesh, blood and ink. The legacy of blood. The numbers alone stagger. Historians estimate that the Camorra Wars of the 1980s claimed over 500 lives. Some count more. Each death a ripple of grief. Each bullet a thread in the tapestry of fear that blanketed Naples. Cutolo's NCO changed the scale of violence. Before him, Camorra disputes were local, small-scale, driven by greed and pride. After him, war became industrial. Dozens killed in weeks, neighborhoods consumed, businesses shattered. The blood he spilled reshaped the Camorra forever. No longer could clans pretend to be mere local guardians. They had become armies, and Naples had become a battlefield. The legacy of ink. But just as enduring as the blood was the ink. In his notebooks, Cutolo left verses, fragments of poetry that scholars still debate today. Some were tender, almost romantic. Others were dark, steeped in fatalism. One fragment reads, "A king without his people is a man with a pen, but words cut deeper than knives, and silence buries deeper than graves." For some, these writings revealed the humanity of a man trapped by circumstance. For others, they were the ultimate hypocrisy, poetry masking brutality. Either way, the ink preserved his myth, because long after the gunshots faded, the words remained. The transformation of the Camorra. Cutolo's greatest legacy may not be his own empire, which collapsed, but the way he forced the Camorra to evolve. Before Cutolo, the Camorra was fragmented, parochial, often dismissed as petty compared to the Sicilian Mafia. Cutolo changed that. He envisioned unity, structure, rituals. Even though the NCO died, rival clans adopted many of his innovations: hierarchy, oaths, discipline. In this sense, the professor reshaped the underworld. The Camorra that followed was more organized, more ruthless, more international. His dream of a single army under his command failed, but his blueprint survived. The paradox of myth. Every gangster leaves a reputation. Most are forgotten once their bloodlines end. But Cutolo's myth endures because it was contradictory. He was a killer who wrote poetry, a philosopher who commanded executions, a man who quoted Dante while drowning Naples in blood. This paradox fascinated journalists, terrified politicians, and seduced followers. It made him more than a criminal. It made him a story. And stories, unlike empires, do not die. The shadow of politics. Perhaps the darkest part of his legacy lies in the whispers of collusion. The Cirillo affair showed that, in moments of desperation, the Italian state may have turned to Cutolo. Whether myth or truth, the idea itself was damning, that democracy, when cornered, looked to a gangster for salvation. For many Italians, this confirmed what they already suspected, that crime and politics were not separate worlds, but two hands of the same body. Cutolo's name, therefore, became not only a symbol of Mafia power, but of the fragility of the Republic itself. The legacy of fear. Even after his power faded, his ghost haunted Naples. Older Neapolitans still warned their children with his name. Shopkeepers still remembered the days when refusing tribute meant death before dawn. Fear outlives men. And in the collective memory of Naples, the Poet King remained a reminder that one man, armed with words and knives, could bend an entire city. The scholar's view. Academics debate him still. Some argue Cutolo was a brilliant strategist who misunderstood the scale of the forces he unleashed. Others call him a narcissist who cloaked sadism in literature. But all agree, he cannot be dismissed as just another gangster. He was something stranger, a man who tried to turn crime into ideology, who tried to make bloodshed into scripture. The final irony. And yet, his end was pitiful. For all the blood spilled, all the verses written, all the myths spun, he died alone in a prison bed. No monuments bear his name. No streets honor his legacy. Even his enemies moved on, building larger empires, accumulating more wealth. The Poet King left behind no throne, no dynasty, only memory, legacy of blood and ink. So what was his true legacy? The blood, 500 lives and a city scarred forever. The ink, verses that made him a paradox, remembered not for riches, but for contradiction. Together, they form the story of Raffaele Cutolo, a story of a man who ruled from a cell, who turned poetry into power, who blurred the line between myth and history. And like all paradoxes, his legacy lingers, not as truth, not as fiction, but as both. The end came quietly. No gunfire, no betrayal, no dramatic escape. In February 2021, at the age of 79, Raffaele Cutolo died in a prison hospital in Parma. After more than half a century behind bars, the Poet King of the Camorra slipped into silence. No crowds gathered outside. No armies saluted his passing. For a man who once commanded thousands, the world seemed almost indifferent. But history was listening. The empty throne. Cutolo left behind no dynasty, no empire. The Nuova Camorra Organizzata, once feared across Naples, had long since crumbled. Its soldiers were dead, imprisoned, or swallowed into rival clans. In the alleys of Ottaviano, where he was born, life went on. Children played soccer in the streets, unaware of the boy who had once carried a knife there. Shopkeepers sold bread without thinking of the tribute once demanded in his name. The throne was empty, the kingdom forgotten, and yet his name still lingered like smoke after fire. The poet's shadow. Journalists who reported his death struggled to define him. Some wrote, Mafia boss. Others, philosopher of crime. A few dared to call him the last romantic gangster. because the paradox endured. He had been a man who scribbled poems about love, about God, about destiny, while signing death warrants with a nod. He had been both tender and ruthless, articulate and merciless, saintly in posture and satanic in deed. This duality was his legend, and legends, unlike empires, do not die with the body. The silence of the state. When the news broke, politicians offered no eulogies. The state did not mourn him. The Republic remembered him only as a criminal, a symbol of the violence that scarred the 1980s. But in whispers, some admitted what history already knew, that once, in the shadows of the Cirillo affair, even the state had reached for Cutolo's hand. That, too, was part of his last verse. The revelation that in Italy, the line between law and crime was sometimes no line at all. The final prison. For decades, Cutolo had called himself a king. But in truth, his kingdom was never Naples. It was his own mind. The prison walls contained his body, but not his myth. He had transformed scraps of poetry into scripture, turning criminals into soldiers. He had conjured a throne from silence, and yet, in the end, he discovered the truest prison of all time. Time erodes loyalty. Time dismantles empires. Time buries myths. Even kings are no match for it. The last verse. In his final notebooks, Cutolo left lines that read like epitaphs. I was a king, but only of shadows. I was a poet, but only of graves. I leave behind nothing but echoes, and in echoes I remain. Whether he meant them as confession or boast, no one could say. But perhaps that was his greatest talent, to blur truth and fiction until both became legend. The poet-king remembered. So how should history remember him? As a murderer who drenched Naples in blood? As a poet who dreamed of order in chaos? As a manipulator who seduced followers with words? Or as a tragic figure, a man who mistook violence for destiny and poetry for redemption? Perhaps the answer is all of them, because Raffaele Cutolo was not just a man. He was a paradox given flesh. Epilogue. In the end, his story is not about triumph or defeat. It is about the strange ways power can shape itself, sometimes with bullets, sometimes with verses. It is about the fragility of kingdoms built on fear. It is about how one man can become both monster and myth, both prisoner and king. And so the tale of Raffaele Cutolo closes with neither roar nor applause, but with silence. Silence, and the memory of a final verse. The poet-king is gone, but the story, the contradiction, the legend, the myth of blood and ink, remains.